today. I do have a very full agenda. This is going to be one of my longer presentations, and so I hope you stick with me through it. But if you don't, that's perfectly okay. These are all recorded and they're placed on our website, so you can watch it later. You can share it, you can rewatch it because there will be a lot of information. So we're going to go through some mental health statistics. We're going to talk about the mental and behavioral symptoms of anxiety, some physical symptoms. Then we're going to kind of briefly go over some of the top anxiety disorders. Then we're going to switch to cognitive distortions, and then I'm going to give you some tips on how we can shift and some tips for stress busting. Yes, I said that right. Okay, felt so weird coming out of my mouth, but I said it right. Okay, so let's hit the ground running, guys. Let me get that out of the way. There we go. So the World Health Organization has an official definition of health. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, okay? So this isn't just the absence of disease or sickness. This is a whole well-being space, okay? Because mental health is essential to our overall health and well-being, it should be recognized and treated in all Americans, including older adults, as well as their caregivers, with the same urgency as physical health. I know the stigma is getting less and less, thankfully, but for a long time, mental health was not taken as seriously into consideration as our physical health. And so when you would say, well, I'm depressed, people would just kind of ignore it or tell you to just, stop being sad, right? But we know now that, treating mental health is the same as treating physical health, right? So if you've got a broken arm, nobody's going to shame you for going to the doctor and getting a cast, right? Just same as with mental health, okay? If you need some help, if you need some professional care for your well-being, we should not feel ashamed for that, okay? Again, it's part of our overall wellness. And so I really encourage everyone to take that into consideration, okay? If you feel like you need to reach out for some professional care, do it, okay? Just like you take your diabetes medication or you exercise or you stop smoking, right? Those are all things that you do for your health, and mental health should be no different. So let's see how prevalent anxiety disorders are. They are the most common mental illness in the United States, affecting 40 million adults, okay? That's 19% of the population. And when I say the word mental illness, I know sometimes that phrase kind of causes people to bristle because, in the past we hear mental illness and we think about all those, horror stories, movies. Hollywood has really done a lot of damage in that regard, what we think mental illness is. So please don't let that term kind of prevent you from hearing what I'm saying. Anxiety is a mental illness, yes, but it is a very common disorder. And people across the globe are impacted. 1 in 13 suffer from anxiety. And it is the most common mental illness globally, okay? And this is all about our nervous system, okay? How it was wired, what's happened to us in our lives that has caused, it to be activated and be more anxious, okay? Annually, we see about 48 million people having anxiety disorders, about 21 million people with major depressive episodes, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. We see 9 million people, and this is just in the US, okay? Bipolar disorder, 7 million. Borderline personality disorder, 3.5 million. Obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, that's 3 million people. And less than 1% have schizophrenia. So you can see the numbers here. Anxiety disorders, they take up the lion's share of these diagnoses that we see in the United States. And the reason I give you all these statistics is because oftentimes we feel like there's something wrong, quote unquote, with me, and nobody understands. I'm all alone. This is such a weird thing that only I'm experiencing. And so it prevents us from seeking assistance or from seeking care because we feel like I should get over this. I shouldn't feel this way, right? And these numbers tell you, you and 48 million other people in the United States are experiencing anxiety disorders, okay? So it is common. It's not something that you should go and hide yourself under a rock if you feel like you can't get your stress levels under control, okay? It's very, very common. very, very treatable. Okay. And the more we understand that, the more likely we are to be proactive in our own care. So, what are some of the symptoms of anxiety? Okay, of course, these are not exhaustive lists that I'm going to give you, but they're very common on what people may be experiencing if they have anxiety. Obsessive thinking, right? That those sticky thoughts that they get in our head and they just kind of spiral around and around and around, right? And we can't stop thinking about them. Maybe we have reactions to things that are kind of disproportionate to the situation, right? Maybe you're like super irritable and so you blow up more than you need to or would like to, right? Feeling restless, right? That idea that you're that feeling that you just can't settle, right? And a lot of times people experience this when they're trying to sleep because there's nothing to distract them. And so they're just very restless. You may have trouble with memory and focus, right? That brain fog can kind of kick in. This is more common in males, but anger, irritability, and aggression. And I think that's more of a cultural thing because typically male bodies are allowed to be angry and female bodies aren't in American culture. So I don't know if we don't experience that as much or we just don't, express it. Insomnia, nightmares, right? Disrupted sleep, having a hard time falling asleep, having a hard time staying asleep. These are all signs of anxiety. Having feelings of panic, fear, and apprehension, right? That you can't control, right? You can't talk yourself out of it. You're just always feeling like there's some threat in your environment. And then having like ritualistic behaviors, like repeated questions, right? I have a kiddo who's very anxious about driving. And so when she gets behind the wheel, she's got a million questions and they're all the same every time, right? Because her body's trying to find some way to confirm safety. And so the questions kind of help alleviate some of that anxiety that she has, okay? Some physical symptoms of anxiety, okay? Racing heart or palpitations, trembles, hot flashes, headaches, or if you have chronic stress, it can even be a migraine disorder, right? Frequent urination, shortness of breath, right? Maybe you have that where you're just really like, you can't have that shortness of breath where you feel like you can't catch your breath, or it could even just be like shallow breathing, okay? Nausea, right? A lot of tummy troubles, tense muscles. We hold a lot of our stress in our shoulders and our lower back. And so that can be a chronic feeling that you have. It's like you just cannot keep your shoulders from reaching up to your ears all the time. Excessive sweating, cold or sweaty hands, and dry mouth. Okay, so these are symptoms, physical symptoms that you can experience when your anxiety or your nervous system is activated. So we're going to get into some of the more common anxiety disorders, okay? The biggest one that you're going to see is generalized anxiety disorder. This affects almost 7 million adults in the United States, okay? So here's some questions you can ask yourself, okay? Of course, this is not to diagnose anybody. This is just for educational purposes. But just think to yourself, do you find it, or do you find yourself worrying about everyday issues for no obvious reason? Right? Maybe there's really not an issue at hand, but you're still worrying about things or the things that could go wrong, even if nothing's actually going wrong. Are you always waiting for disaster to strike or excessively worried about things, right? We're just waiting for, oh, I've had a couple good days, so I know something bad's coming my way, right? There's always something on horizon that's going to mess up your whole flow, right? So generalized anxiety disorder can make your daily life feel like you're in a constant state of worry, fear, or dread. Okay, so generalized anxiety disorder means you're just generally anxious. Okay, there's not a specific thing that's happening in your life that's causing the anxiety. You're just generally in this state all the time. Okay. Some symptoms: worrying excessively about everyday things. Okay. Now remember, worrying excessively. There's a lot to be worried about, obviously, but we're talking about excessively. Having trouble controlling your worries or feelings of nervousness. Maybe you're very aware that you worry more than you should, but you can't help it. Having that difficulty relaxing, that restlessness, not being able to concentrate very well. Maybe you startle easily, right? Maybe someone just walks in the room, hey, mom, and you're, through the roof, right? You have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, headaches, muscle aches, stomach aches, or just unexplained pains, right? Like, ooh, why does this hurt? I didn't do anything to it. A tremble or a twitch, okay? Or always feeling on edge, right? Like at any moment you could just snap. Not necessarily in anger, but you can just kind of feel yourself being unsettled, okay? So this is generalized anxiety disorder, very quickly through. Let's go into some more commonly diagnosed anxiety disorders. So we have social anxiety disorder. So this is not the same as introversion. Okay, introversion is about how do we recharge? Are we recharged around people or recharged more in isolation? Okay, that's introversion and extroversion. Social anxiety disorder is a totally different beast. Okay, and it affects 15 million adults. That's a lot of people. So a question you can ask yourself: am I afraid of being judged by others? Self-conscious in everyday social situations. Now, this can be true for a lot of people who do not have social anxiety disorder, okay? But if that sounds familiar, let's keep going and see if that is something you can identify with a little bit deeper. So doing everyday things like eating or drinking in front of people, using public restrooms, this can cause anxiety or fear because the concern is that you're going to be judged, humiliated, or rejected, okay? So it's not just, oh, I'm shy, right? It's I can't do these things in front of people because I'm going to be humiliated doing it. Okay. So this is the fear that people have in social situations that's so intense that they feel like it's beyond their control. Okay. And so they're going to avoid doing things like going to work, going to school, right? Going to the grocery store because of that fear of being judged, humiliated, or rejected is so intense that it impacts the way you function in your daily life. Okay. A lot of people do these things and still have anxiety while they do them. But it's the fear of, that everyone's going to look and point and laugh at you, right? That's the social anxiety disorder, okay? And you may worry about social things weeks in advance, right? So maybe you've got your cousin's getting married in June, and today you're having panic about being around so many people, right? What are they going to think of me, right? And you're maybe being very meticulous about what you're going to wear and how you're going to act and how your hair is going to be done because you don't want to give anybody any reason to judge you, okay? And so you have a preoccupation with that worry. Okay, that's when it becomes a disorder. And it's not just shyness. Okay, so there's some more stats. Most of these I went through already. Generalized anxiety disorder, women are twice as likely to be affected than men. Panic disorder, this affects 6 million adults in the US, and women, again, are twice as likely to be affected as men. And my assumption is that culturally, women are conditioned to kind of hold a lot of that in. And so it can kind of reemerge and manifest in this disordered way. Social anxiety disorder. This is equally common amongst men and women, and it typically begins around age 13. So those really, really precious moments in our life where we're kind of learning who we are, we're forming identity as we go into our adult space. It's already so incredibly fragile, and so it makes sense that that's when this disorder would kind of start to surface. And then people who just have general phobias, that's 9.1% of the US population. And again, women are twice as likely as men to be affected by these disorders. All right. So now we're going to get into the meat of this presentation because this, I think, is something that could bring a lot of clarity to how our brains on a daily basis can kind of sabotage us. Okay. So we went through a little bit of the anxiety. Now we're going to talk about some of our unhealthy thinking patterns. Okay. So a cognitive distortion or a distorted thought, this is an exaggerated pattern of thinking that's not based on facts, okay? So this can lead us to view things more negatively than they already are. And our brains are already wired with a negativity bias, okay? This is a survival mechanism that we have, right? Because it's much more beneficial for us as a species to assume there's danger when there isn't. Because if we assume there's danger and there isn't, we're safe, right? But if we don't assume there's danger and there is, guess what? We might not be so safe. So our brains always default to the extreme to keep us safe, okay? And that happens to all of us. But a cognitive distortion is kind of more intense in that spiraling, okay? So again, it's not based on fact. Our thoughts have a great impact on how we feel and how we behave, okay? So when we treat negative thoughts as facts, we're often going to find ourselves acting in a way based off of faulty assumptions, okay? We're going to get into some examples later, and you'll hopefully see exactly what I'm talking about. But this is part of the human experience, okay? Everyone falls into these distortions sometimes, right, on occasion. And it can particularly be more prevalent when we're kind of feeling down or feeling insecure or feeling, maybe we're experiencing something new and we're not really sure our place in that space. These cognitive distortions can get a little bit louder, okay? But of course, if we engage too frequently in these negative thoughts, it can really impact our mental health in a negative way. So that's why it's important to kind of be aware of what they are. And then when you're engaging in them, and then having tools to kind of reframe or redirect those thoughts. And I'll give you those examples later on. So here's some examples. Your loved one compliments your love and dedication to visiting them several times. In the end, they make one improvement suggestion. You leave the visit feeling miserable and dwell on that one suggestion all day long. So this is what we call mental filtering. So this is very common, but this is where we kind of strain all the positives in a situation and we just dwell on that negative thing, okay? So even though your loved one complimented you and showered you with all this affirmation, they made one suggestion of improvement and then automatically everything positive they said about you doesn't mean anything, right? It's just that one critique that is now the focal point of the entire visit, okay? So that is what we call mental filtering. And again, we all do this, okay? Next one. Your favorite staff member was a saint until she told you no for one request, and now you cannot stand her, okay? This is what we call all or nothing thinking or polarization, okay? So this is when we see the world in black or white, there's no shade of gray, okay? So either she's perfect or she's horrible, okay? They like me, they hate me, okay? There's no gray area, okay? So you think, oh, this staff member is amazing. She's never given me any problems and no reason not to like her. And then she sets a boundary one time and automatically, I can't stand her. I never liked her, right? Next one. You speak up at a family care plan meeting and your suggestions are not included in the final decision. So you leave the meeting thinking, I never say the right thing. Okay, so this is a big one. And I think a lot of us fall into this and don't even realize it's a negative thinking pattern. This is what we call overgeneralization. Okay, so we are taking an isolated negative event and turning it into a never-ending pattern of loss and defeat. Okay, so when you find yourself using words like always, never, everything, nothing, okay, that could be an indicator that you're having these overgeneralizing thoughts, okay? So an example from my life is I would say, I always take out the trash. Nobody else ever does this, right? That's not true. I just live in a house with a lot of people and multiple people are taking the trash out throughout the day. It just seems full all the time because there's people there all the time, right? But in my head, I'm thinking, I'm the only one who ever does this. No one else ever does this but me. Okay, that's an overgeneralization because that's not true. That's not based on fact. That's based on how I feel in the moment. Okay. And I'm sure you guys can come up with some examples in your own life as I'm going through this. Next example. Your loved one greets you without a smile and they look serious. So instead of asking how they are, you immediately assume that they're mad at you. This is what we call jumping to conclusions. Okay, so we're interpreting an event or a situation negatively without any evidence to support that conclusion. And then we react to the assumption, okay? So we think somebody's mad at us. They're not mad at us, but we think they are. And so then we can jump into a reaction of, well, let me make it better. Let me fawn, or let me get defensive because I didn't even do anything wrong. Why are you mad at me, right? They're not mad at you. You just jumped to the conclusion that they were based on their response, their body language, okay? Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they're having a headache. Maybe they're mad at somebody else and you just happen to walk in the room, right? But we do this all the time and we don't even realize we're doing it. All right, your loved one didn't call you this morning. They probably reached for the phone, fell, was stuck on the floor for hours, broke their hip, and they had to have an ambulance come out to get them, okay? This is what we call catastrophizing, okay? So this is related to jumping to conclusions, but in this case, we jump to the worst possible conclusion in every scenario, okay? So, maybe your loved one didn't call you because, they had a headache, or maybe their phone wasn't charged, or maybe they forgot. But in your head, they're lying dead in a ditch somewhere, right? Again, if you think about our nervous system trying to kind of get ahead of the game and alert us to danger so we can avoid it, this makes sense, right? We assume the worst so that we can game plan on how to fix it, right? But the worst doesn't always happen. And we make things worse when we let this anxiety tell us what our reality actually is, okay? Next example. You get irritated with your loved one and think to yourself, I should never feel that way ever, okay? So the cognitive distortion here is our shoulds, okay? These are statements that we have subjective ironclad rules that we set for ourselves and others without considering the specifics of a circumstance. So we tell ourselves that things should be a certain way with no exceptions, right? So, maybe you believe that you should always make your bed, or you should always make people laugh, or you should be better, right? These are things maybe you're constantly telling yourselves. But when these things don't happen, and that can depend on a lot of factors, then we feel guilty or disappointed, or like we let somebody down or frustrated, okay? So we kind of set up these arbitrary things about what should be happening, and we don't really take into consideration that, life is different and different circumstances happen, and it's not a moral failing if we don't make our bed in the morning, right? But we set these standards, and then when we don't meet them, then we feel frustrated, and then we start to feel like inadequate or whatever else, right? So even just setting yourself up for that can be a cognitive distortion. Next one. You may firmly believe something bad will happen today because you woke up feeling anxious. Okay? That happens a lot, right? I just woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Today's going to be awful, right? This is what we call emotional reasoning. So this is when we believe that the way we feel is a reflection of reality. Now, oftentimes it is, right? I'm not asking anybody to ignore how they feel, but I am inviting you to be a little curious about how you feel, okay? So we can tell ourselves, I feel this way, so it has to be a fact, right? That's what defines this distortion. And it could also lead you to believe that future events depend on how you feel, right? And you might also assess random situations based on your emotional reaction. Now, sometimes we have emotional reactions to things based off of our experiences in the past that don't really have hold any weight in the situation we're in, right? But we'd be like, well, I felt this way. I felt like this was going to be a problem, so it's probably going to be a problem. So I'm going to go ahead and act accordingly, right? So we're allowing our emotions to determine our reality, okay? Just got a few more examples. You bring your loved one a new article of clothing and they don't say thank you. So you just know that they hate it. Okay, so this is what we call mind reading. This is when we assume that we know what other people are thinking, and then we react to what we assume they're thinking. Okay, so with this distortion, we may also assume that other people are thinking negatively about us, right? Most of these distortions aren't going to leave you feeling like, people are like in love with you and that you're perfect, right? They're almost always going to beat you down. Okay, so that's how we can kind of determine like these are not healthy for us, right? Because it decreases our mood. So we need to consider all the evidence, not just the evidence that confirms our suspicions or beliefs, right? Maybe they didn't say thank you because they forgot, or maybe they're preoccupied, or, you know, a myriad of reasons why they didn't say thank you. That doesn't mean that they hate the gift, right? But we try to read people's minds, and instead of clarifying, we respond to our assumption, okay? And that can get us in all kinds of sticky problems. All right, last example. You want your loved one to smile big and hug you when you come to see them, despite them never showing much emotion or being affectionate. So every time you see them, you let them know how upset you are for them not smiling and hugging you. And eventually you know that they're going to change their ways and want to hug and kiss you upon arrival, right? So this is what we call the fallacy of change. This is where we expect other people to change their ways to suit our expectations or needs, particularly when we pressure them enough. Now, this is not to say that you cannot share your needs and communicate with people about how you want to be treated. Okay, that's perfectly acceptable. That's okay. But when we expect somebody who's never been affectionate to suddenly become affectionate because we've complained enough, that's the fallacy of change. We're expecting something from somebody that they've never been or never exhibited to us before. Okay, we want people to change so that we feel better, and we're going to put pressure on them to change, and they may not change. Okay. All right. So there's thousands of cognitive distortions. I just highlighted a very few that I find are very common. And they can be changed. Okay. So we identify the cognitive distortion. What do we do next? Okay. So when we realize that a thought is causing us anxiety or maybe lowering our mood, a good first step is just to figure out what kind of distorted thinking is taking place. Okay. And you can Google cognitive distortions or harmful thinking patterns, and you're going to get a whole bunch. Okay. So we identify what that distortion is. Next, we try to reframe that thought. Okay. So we want to look for shades of gray, alternate explanations, and objective evidence. Okay. Positive interpretations that expand our thinking. So it might be helpful to write down the original thought and then 3 or 4 alternative interpretations. So I'll use the example of taking out the trash again, right? Where I had that, I'm the only one who ever does this. Okay. An alternative thought would be, I just don't see other people doing it. But if it was just me doing it, we'd probably have trash all over the place because I only do it once a day, right? But I have a house full of 7 people. So obviously we're going to do it more than once, right? So just kind of a different interpretation with the same information, okay? And that can help. That can help with your cognitive distortion, because what you're doing is you're kind of grabbing it out of the air and you're examining it for what it is, and then you're giving it a rewrite, okay? So you're not ignoring behaviors, you're not ignoring thoughts, you're being curious about them, okay? You're not allowing those thoughts to dictate your actions. Another thing we can do, perform a cost-benefit analysis or like a pro or con list, very simple. If we are getting a benefit from a behavior, we're typically going to repeat that behavior, okay? So we might find it helpful to analyze how the thought pattern has helped us cope in the past, okay? Did they give us a sense of control when we felt powerless? Do they allow us to avoid taking responsibility or prevent us from taking risks, okay? And then we can also ask, what is this distortion costing me? Okay, well, it's costing me my peace of mind. It's costing me a lot of energy and time trying to figure out the solution to a problem that is not really even there, right? So when we weigh the pros and cons of our thought patterns, that can motivate us to change them, okay? And some of you may be thinking, well, I'm not benefiting from being in a foul mood all time. Okay. Well, do a little introspection and see if there's really no cost, or if there's really no gain to that behavior, then it should be very easy for you to switch it, right? One thing you can do, you can contact a therapist and you can learn what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT, okay? This has been widely used for decades. It is probably one of the most effective treatment modalities for therapists, and it kind of bleeds into everything. And it has a lot of science behind it as to why it works, how it works, and it's just kind of overall been very beneficial for multiple types of people and multiple types of situations, okay? So this is where we learn to identify, interrupt, and change these unhealthy thinking patterns, okay? We usually will focus on specific goals, right? And then we also have like a predetermined amount of sessions, and it can take a couple weeks or take a couple months before we see results. Because again, you're trying to rewire patterns in your brain, right? That are supposed to be there to keep you safe, but they're really just, keeping you up at night, right? So being consistent and being aware can be very, very powerful going forward to kind of squash some of these distortions. Another thing we can do, we can replace absolutes, okay? So when we focus our thoughts and recognize a pattern, we can consider replacing those statements. Instead of saying always or nothing, we can say sometimes or in this moment, okay? Sometimes I'm the only one taking out the trash. Sucks, but that's okay. So sometimes, right? Not always, not all the time. Defining yourself and others. So try labeling the behavior, okay? So instead of labeling ourselves as lazy because we didn't clean today, we can just say, I didn't clean today, right? One action doesn't define you, okay? This is kind of when those should distortions come in, right? I should have cleaned today and I didn't, I'm lazy, right? You can just say, well, I didn't clean today because I took a day off. That's okay, right? So you're not denying the action. You're just reframing it. You're thinking about it from a more healthy angle, okay? That's not causing you stress, hopefully. We can search for positive aspects, okay? So this can be very challenging at first, especially if our brain is in this pattern of always finding the negative. But we can try to find at least 3 positive examples in each situation, okay? And it may not feel natural to you at first, that's okay. But all new habits feel awkward at first. And then before we know it, it's just habit and it's just the way we operate and the way we move through the world, okay? And then we can think too, does the evidence back this thought up? Okay. So before we draw conclusions, we need to ask ourselves, be curious, investigate, right? Do we have all the facts needed to support this distorted thought? Okay. And take some extra effort to believe the facts once you've collected them, right? So I want mom to embrace me and smile and be affectionate with me when I come see her. But the evidence says that that's just not her personality. She's never been that way. She's always found other ways to show she loves me, right? So we can believe the facts and not respond to our feeling or our emotion about the situation, okay? And again, I'm not saying in all cases, because sometimes our emotions, they lead us down the right path, and we need to be in spaces where we can trust our intuition about things. This is specifically for the distortions, okay? And then writing down the thought. This can be very, very impactful. Even if you're not a journaler, right? You can just jot a thought down because this is a really effective way to reduce our worry. So writing about caregiving emotions like anxiety can reduce the intensity of those feelings. Getting thoughts out of our head and down on paper, it gives it somewhere else to live besides our brain. And this can help you feel calmer and less stressed. And also when we see our thoughts out on paper, it can give us a different perspective, right? And it can also make it easier to recognize and change those thought patterns and that distorted thinking, right? Because if I said, I'm going to write on a piece of paper, my husband doesn't love me because he didn't swap the laundry over, right? That sounds ridiculous when I write it out, but in my head, it made perfect sense, right? So the benefits of journaling, okay? It can help us find solutions to tough challenges. Why? Because writing out our thoughts help us connect those dots. And it can help us come up with solutions that maybe we weren't going to be able to think about, especially when we've got that loud thought kind of bouncing around in our head and we can't really think of solutions, right? So next time you're up against a sticky caregiving challenge, just try writing out what's going on And this can help you think of a creative way to solve the problem, and that can make your caregiving a lot more smooth, right? Journaling can make caregiving easier because writing things down helps us to see patterns, right? If you think about that cognitive distortion of that mental filtering, right? Where in our mind, this person's always, mad at me, or, you're drawing these conclusions that always leave you in a negative light. But then when you write them down, you can start to see, well, maybe that pattern doesn't hold as much weight as I thought it did, right? Maybe I'm just picking out the little things and I'm neglecting to see all the positive things that, the pattern actually supports, right? So we can spot things that could be improved, simplified, or eliminated to make our lives run more smoothly. We maybe will start to notice that mom gets upset every time we talk about leaving the house, but doesn't make a fuss if you just leave. So then you can just leave, right? Or maybe you'll find that your spouse is much more willing to bathe during the early afternoon than in the evening, right? You're writing those patterns down and you're starting to see, oh, okay, that makes sense. I'll just shift a little bit. I'll make one little step to the left or to the right, and then boom, I'm not as anxious anymore, right? Journaling can help us resolve arguments with other people. So when we write about fights or misunderstandings, it can help from things kind of stewing in our mind, right? And overthinking. And it could even help us to see another person's perspective, right? And find a way to resolve the conflict. So our minds are very beautiful and very powerful, but they can also be incredibly obnoxious because they will hold on to things and magnify things that maybe are not necessarily the whole story, right? So writing things down can help. And if nothing else, the actual physical act of writing something down, it gives you that time, that buffer between your reaction, like the thing that happened, and your reaction to that thing. Okay. Because sometimes we don't get to respond the way we want to because we're too busy reacting. So just giving yourself that little buffer to write about it can really help you kind of collect yourself and respond the way that you really want to respond. All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left. Let me go into some more of this stuff real quick. Hold on, where am I? There we go. Okay. How can we change cognitive distortions? Okay, again, this could be something that you can start on your own, but it can be something that you can start with a therapist as well. But staying grateful and positive. So looking for and reminding ourselves of the positive things, this kind of helps to rein in those out of control thoughts. Remember, I told you we have a negativity bias in our brain. We're automatically going to assume, well, we may not automatically assume, but our brains are wired to notice potential threat before potential good. Okay. So when we are looking for glimmers, positivity, gratitude, that reorients our focus in our brain to the positives rather than the negatives, okay? So just to be clear though, being grateful or positive doesn't mean that we ignore negative feelings, okay? We don't want to do that. And it doesn't mean that you're supposed to be thankful no matter how hard life gets, because that's unrealistic as well. But gratitude is about noticing that there's always something that is positive in your life, okay, no matter how dark things may seem. So being aware of that can help us to get a different perspective and see that things are not 100% terrible all of the time, okay? So maybe consider keeping a gratitude journal or a gratitude calendar, or there's even like gratitude, like 10-day or 21-day challenges that you can find online. And that can be very helpful too. Talking nicely to ourselves, yikes. We fail at this all the time, don't we? Right? It's okay for you to do it, but if I do it, I'm a terrible person, right? We do that all the time. But positive self-talk is a very effective anxiety reduction tool. And so self-talk is basically that voice that's always in our head, right? It's kind of always narrating things. Sometimes it's encouraging, sometimes it feels like it's sabotaging us, right? But it usually happens without us even noticing. And it can be positive or negative, but it just kind of automatically happens, right? We're almost always thinking. And so when we speak to ourselves in positive and supportive ways, of course, that's going to feel a lot more pleasant and calming than that steady stream of negativity, okay? And for those of us who maybe grew up in spaces where our caregivers were very negative in their language, that kind of wires our internal dialogue towards that negativity. Okay, so it can be really difficult to even catch it, let alone reorient it. Okay, so hopefully with this presentation, you're starting to think maybe a little bit more like aware of your own thoughts, and so you can catch them a little bit easier. So we can reduce anxiety if we work on decreasing the amount and the intensity of negative self-talk and increasing that positive self-talk. Okay, so a very simple trick: talk to yourself the way that a friend or a close family member would talk to you. Right? How would somebody who loves you speak to you? Probably supportive, probably kind, probably not berating you or discouraging you, right? So treat yourself in that same positive way, okay? And if you don't have a person in your life that speaks positively to you, you can always pretend that I'm doing it, because I will never say anything mean about you. All right, so here's a little worksheet that you all can do as well. This is just an example. There's a ton of these online that are for free, but this is what we call a silver linings positive psychology exercise, okay? So this would just be something that you would do daily for a couple weeks just to kind of reinforce a new pattern. But the step one is list 5 things that make your life enjoyable. Okay, so it can be something like sunshine on my skin, my health, I've got a full pantry, or I had my favorite coffee this morning, right? Just things that make your life enjoyable. Don't have to be life-changing, groundbreaking things. It could just be very simple, like I like my makeup today, right? Whatever. Step 2, describe a recent time something didn't go your way or you felt upset or frustrated. Okay, so that could be any random thing. I couldn't find matching socks this morning and I was late to work. That's frustrating, right? And then step 3 is the silver lining. So we can spend some time reflecting on the silver linings from the situation in step 2. Okay, so we'll describe 3 of those silver linings. Okay, I couldn't find matching socks, but I ended up wearing a pair of sandals that I think were really cute and matched my outfit better anyways, right? So I was very generic. This probably not what you're worried about during the day, but that's what I came up off the top of my head. But this something simple like this, right? Where we're just really being intentional. What are we thinking about? And what are we thinking about the thoughts we're thinking? Okay, that is a unique human capacity to think about thinking. Okay, that's the byproduct of consciousness. So we can utilize that instead of letting these thoughts just kind of run wild and hijack our mind and our attitude and our emotions. We can kind of get curious about them, nail them down, and we want to kind of fill that positivity bucket more intentionally than that negativity bucket that kind of just impulsively filled by our brain. Okay, hope that makes sense. Acknowledging your strengths. Okay, this is something that I find caregivers specifically have a really hard time with, which to me is very interesting because every day you exhibit your strengths from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to bed. But I also know that the personality type of people who find themselves in caregiving situations, you're almost always other focused. And so thinking about yourself and turning that care back to yourself can be very uncomfortable because it's not something you're used to. Okay. But listing our strengths and how we describe or how we use those strengths in everyday life and how we've used those strengths to overcome specific challenges. This little exercise can be very impactful to kind of boost your confidence, right? To kind of help us stop that spiral in its tracks and go back the other way, right? So here's just an example of some strengths: artistic ability, love of learning, humor, optimism, independence, flexibility. Okay, these are all just things that it doesn't have to be, oh, well, I'm a operatic soprano singer or I can create, the statue of David in my backyard with mud, and those are very impressive, but your strengths don't have to be these amazing, groundbreaking, crazy skills or talents. It can just be like, hey, one of my strengths is I am a good listener, right? That's served me well in my life. Okay. So maybe be a little bit creative, think outside the box on what a strength actually is. Okay. I have amazing follow through, right? That's a good strength. All right. Very briefly, I might have to skip some of these slides, just to be honest with you, because I have way more than I thought I did. So how do we get over something called fear of disappointing others, or FODO? This is a very common thought, negative thinking pattern that I see in caregivers also. Chronic stress, anxiety, overwhelm, and burnout are driven a lot of the times by this fear of disappointing other people, okay? A lot of people who struggle with chronic stress and burnout have a really hard time setting boundaries with people, okay? You're stressed out because you can't say no, or you're unwilling to say no because you're afraid someone is going to be disappointed with you, okay? And so then we just take on so much that we really don't have the reserves for, because we don't want to disappoint somebody else, okay? So that means if you want to deal with your chronic stress or anxiety or burnout or overwhelm, you have to deal with that root cause, which in many cases is this hidden fear of disappointing other people or people pleasing. Okay, you guys have probably heard that phrase before. And there's really only one way to get over it. Okay, you kind of have to face it repeatedly and willingly. So that means if you want to get over your excessive fear of disappointing other or your people pleasing tendencies, you have to be willing to do the thing that might lead them to be disappointed. Okay, I can't do that for you because I don't have time. I don't have resources. Okay. And oftentimes, like say you carve out a little bit of time for respite, and then someone says, oh, since you're free that day, could you do A, B, and C for me? And instead of prioritizing your respite for your well-being, you say, okay, I don't want you to be disappointed, or I don't want to let you down. And so then you sacrifice that respite to do something for somebody else. Okay. And a good boundary would be, I really need to protect this respite time because it's necessary for my overall health, right? So it might look to somebody else that you have free time, but you know it's not free. It's already occupied with rest, right? And that can be really hard for a lot of you to say that, right? I have to prioritize rest over you. And that seems selfish, and we can feel guilty for that. But I promise you, if you start setting these little boundaries and allowing those little pockets of respite, or saying, you know, hey, my plate's full, I can't do these extra things for you, they'll get over it. Okay. They absolutely will get over it. Okay. What you won't get over is the constant, you know, overproducing, overworking, right? Well, you will get over it eventually, but you know, that could definitely lead to a burnout or a crash out situation. So you have to be very, very protective of those boundaries. Okay. And it's okay to disappoint people. Okay. There's a cost of this, right? There's a cost and consequences to never saying no. All that emotional energy that you're spending worrying and stressing over that decision is energy you now have to not be present and emotionally available for the important things in your life, okay? Like the loved one you're caring for. There's an emotional opportunity cost to you, your fear, or sorry, there are emotional opportunity costs to your fear of disappointing others and avoiding facing up to that fear. So just make sure that you approach them from a place of self-compassion and not self-criticism, okay? Remember, you're not responsible for other people's emotions, okay? You may be responsible for a lot in other people's lives, especially as a caregiver, okay? But you are not responsible for people's emotions. You can't be held responsible for things you can't control. And you wouldn't blame someone for being short or having brown eyes, right? Of course not. That's because A, there's nothing morally wrong with having brown eyes, and B, they have no control over it. So similarly, whether someone else feels disappointed in you may be unfortunate, but it's neither morally wrong or something that you have direct control over. So how we feel is the result of how we think, which means other people's emotions are their responsibility, not yours. Okay? You are responsible for your actions, not other people's feelings. So of course we do have a responsibility to behave well. We're not going to go out there and just be, you know, tyrants and goblins in the streets. But we can control our behavior. But how another person interprets and feels about your behavior is not something that you can control. Okay. So it's not something we should judge ourselves on being right or wrong, good or bad. Okay. If somebody feels disappointed because you said no, that's on them. Okay. And we can reframe our fear as uncomfortable, not dangerous. Okay. So remember, emotions like fear and anxiety are uncomfortable and sometimes painful, but they are not dangerous in and of themselves. Okay. And one of the reasons why we have a hard time facing our fears is because our tolerance for fear itself is very low. And it's low because we mistakenly assume that because fear and anxiety feel bad, they are bad. And so we avoid them at all costs. And so if we want to get over our fear of disappointing others, we're going to have to face that fear head on. Okay. We're going to have to be willing to feel afraid and tolerate that feeling for a little while. Okay. So just because it feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. Okay. And of course, that's not a cardinal rule for everything. We're talking about this specifically. But we can reframe our fear as uncomfortable, but not dangerous. And we might be a little more likely to tolerate it instead of impulsively trying to avoid it. Okay. Remember, anxiety, fear, these are all signals, they're communication from our nervous system. And it's not necessarily always we have to respond right away. Try to see it as this is an invitation to be curious. Okay. Why is my nervous system responding this way? Why am I feeling anxious? Why am I feeling afraid? Is there really truly a threat? Or is it just me assuming the worst? Right? So it's an invitation to be curious. Okay. And then I'll end with this one here, self-care. So there are steps we can take to boost our mental wellness and emotional resilience. And we talk about self-care all the time. But here's just some basic ones, okay? So this is just your basic body needs, okay? Get enough sleep. Sleep is vital. Lack of sleep can exacerbate depressive symptoms and make us more irritable, okay? So if you are someone who struggles with sleep, and I know some of you have loved ones who are up and about all, hours of the night and you can't help that, okay? But if you're someone who struggles with sleep because of anxiety and worry keeping you up at night, there are a lot of things that you can do. We call it sleep hygiene that can kind of signal to your body it's time to rest. And consistent use of that sleep hygiene routine over time will improve your sleep. Okay. Staying active. Okay. Exercise can help us improve our mood and strengthen our heart and lungs. And we don't have to go and be, Arnold Schwarzenegger in the gym. This can be, weekly walks, maybe a couple days out of the week, we do a walk, we do some stretches, maybe a little bit of light cardio, whatever makes sense for your body at the time. Try to be active as much as you can. And then, of course, eating well is very important for our overall wellness, but also it can help with our mental health as well, okay? It can give us more energy, and this can prevent an increase in our symptoms like anxiety, okay? And here are some free apps, if you guys are interested, to download that can help relieve caregiver anxiety. There's What's Up. This is a great all-around app. It has a lot of information about anxiety and stress management tools that can be really, really useful. CBT Mind Shift. This can help with fast anxiety relief. So Mind Shift kind of helps you just kind of take that breath, shift your thinking, and take steps to cope. Okay, it's kind of like again, just kind of that buffer between the situation and your reaction to that situation. It's got a lot of tools for reducing anxiety, and it's based on CBT, which is scientifically based, and then we know it works. Stop Panic and Anxiety Self-Help. This is designed to help with panic attacks. So not everybody experiences panic attacks, but many of you do. And so that can help. It's got audio tracks that cover panic assistance, emotional training, and relaxation. Okay. So those are just some tips. This is kind of an older presentation, so I'm sure there's more that have come out since I made this presentation, but you can probably just go into any, Google Play or the App Store on Apple and just look up, anxiety relieving apps. I personally subscribe to the Calm app. That one I think has been very, very useful for me over the last couple of years. It has meditations, it's got just nature sounds, it's got stories, it's got daily movement practices that you can do. So I highly recommend that to anyone who's looking for something that can actually help. All right. It's 10:59 and I made it through. I did skip about 3 slides, but that's okay. I'm sorry if I went really quickly, but I had like over 40 slides. So if you want to get this information again, you want to rewatch it, it will be on our website early next week. But I think the older presentation when I did it like last year is also on there, so you don't have to wait if you don't want to. But I hope this was informational. I hope it was useful. I hope it inspired you to maybe, become curious a little bit on what you're thinking and why you're thinking it and how you can maybe reframe some of those thoughts. Because again, sometimes you don't even realize that your thinking is distorted. It's just the way you've always thought about things. And so hopefully this maybe gave you a little bit of inspiration to kind of do a little deeper dive in your own experiences and see where you can maybe give yourself a little bit of that nurturing self-care and reframe some of these thoughts. Okay, look for the evidence and don't let your emotions rule you because they're not always accurate. All right. So thank you guys for taking time with me today. I didn't get to any chat questions, so I apologize for that. But if you do have any questions, you want to follow up with me, go ahead and send me an email. And also, if you're interested in working with me from a therapeutic perspective, I am licensed now. I am taking clients, so just reach out to me and I'll give you that referral link. And our services are, of course, free of charge to caregivers. So let me know if you're interested and I'll get you that information, okay? All right, everyone, I gotta go. It's 11. I don't want to disrespect your time. So enjoy your weekend and I will see you hopefully next week, okay? All right, bye, everyone.